Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all so much for coming today. This is such a tremendous response. We didn't know what to expect exactly, being a strange year and June sometimes being a season where people are off doing other things. But we so appreciate you all making the time and coming to connect today. My name is Sheryl Johnson. I'm the program coordinator of the Women's Studies and Religion program at GTU, and I'm also a PhD student. And yeah, the Women's Studies and Religion program is just a really wonderful community at GTU. We offer a certificate, and this certificate is something that you can do alongside any degree program at the GTU. You don't have to take any additional courses necessarily to be able to complete the certificate. And so it's just a wonderful opportunity to earn something else while you're already doing whatever degree you are. And we also offer a Women's Studies and Religion seminar every year. We offer all sorts of events throughout the year. So if you're interested in getting more involved, there's information on our website, also on Facebook. Also, if you want to join our mailing list, you can just type your email into the chat box, and I will add you to that mailing list. So yeah, please consider if you'd like to get connected or spread the word. Just want to let everyone know that we are recording today. So if you're not comfortable being recorded, please just make sure your camera is off, and just want to let you know that that's happening. And so hopefully those recordings will be available afterwards for those who missed today or who want to see something again. We're going to keep everyone on mute today. So just so you know, if you do have questions, we might have time for some questions later on. You can just type those into the chat box though. And finally, we're going to hope to keep our time today to about an hour. Might go slightly over that, but just so folks know generally what we're hoping for. But of course, we do understand if you need to leave at any point. So now I'm going to turn it over to Professor of Theological Ethics, Cynthia Moe-Lobeda, also my advisor and a member of our steering committee. So just really wonderful person to welcome and then introduce our main speaker for today. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Sheryl. I am so pleased to introduce Reverend Dr. Valerie Miles-Tribble. She is a prominent voice in one of the most significant theological and ethical developments of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. That is womanist theoethics. Dr. Miles-Tribble is a womanist scholar in practical theology and ethics. She is a community activist and an ordained clergywoman, currently serving a parish, in addition to her full-time faculty position. In all of those arenas, we have learned that Dr. Miles-Tribble examines social justice praxis in church and society with an aim of restorative justice. She is currently the Associate Professor of Ministerial Leadership and Practical Theology at the Berkeley School of Theology, which many of us know more recently, until recently, as the American Baptist Seminary of the West. She is also on the core doctoral faculty of the Graduate Theological Union. Valerie holds a Master of Divinity and Doctor of Ministry degrees from GTU schools, and also a PhD, we could call her Reverend Dr. A PhD in Leadership and Organizational Change from Walden University. Her service roles include serving on the steering committee of the American Academy of Religion's Womanist Approaches section, serving in a leadership role in the Women of Color National Network, and serving as regional coordinator for the Rise Together Mentor Network, which is a network that supports intergenerational empowerment for millennial leaders. Today, we are so pleased to have Reverend Dr. Miles-Tribble exploring with us her recent and acclaimed book, Change Agent Church in Black Lives Matter Times, Urgency for Action. So, Dr. Miles-Tribble, this book is an incredibly powerful and timely and urgently needed book. Tell us about it. What do you most value about your book? What is at its heart?
Thank you so much, Cynthia. I first want to thank our faculty and student steering committee members of the GTU Women's Studies of Religion certificate program for this opportunity. And I have to say that because they urged me as the current chairwoman to go forward with this chair's lecture forum, even in our virtual COVID-19 reality. The idea to extend from a pure lecture to a chat invites further discourse after my opening remarks. So I'm pleased that I'm not just standing alone in this effort. And let me also thank you, my esteemed colleague, Dr. Cynthia Moe-Lobeda, who is a wonderful encourager and serves on our steering committee and is a brilliant ecofeminist ethicist in her own right. And I thank you for helping me to navigate our virtual chat today for the purposes of introducing this book. So let us move on to our theme for today and the context of the book and the reflection on being change agents for justice amid two pandemics, the killer virus, COVID-19, and the killer systems of virulent racism. And I'd like to start with our theme, being change agents for justice, and why this Zoominar should spark a chord for Black women, multicultural women, and supporters of women, and non-binary women's voices and leadership. The book's release, Change Agent Church and Black Lives Matter Times, Urgency for Action, is timely at a juncture when conventional media has refocused attention on the justice mantra, Black Lives Matter, with mixed reactions in our nation. And of course, Black people had not stopped invoking the words as an ethos or living into its reality to protest ongoing injustices. By the time the onslaught of COVID-19 in January 2020 began, or I should say came to America's attention, the Change Agent Church book was in production. And thus I will say now that somebody out there needs to write more about the links between the pandemic's impact on already at-risk communities of Black and brown families. This health crisis undeniably exposed the truth about disparities of disenfranchisement, as I point out in the book, but I pointed out with many pre-COVID examples. Furthermore, the traumatic threat to health and safety from repeated denial of emergency services, testing, and access to safety gear for Blacks and poor people of color is further exacerbated by the exponential rise in resurgent racialized violence targeted against Black and brown bodies already traumatized by COVID-19 realities in this killer system of virulent racism. So these connections underscore the pernicious ideology of white supremacy impacting us, whether Black or not, those who are disenfranchised and those who think they are privileged. And I would argue that the beneficiaries of unjust privileging are as culpable as the perpetrators, unless and until conscientious action is taken to challenge these structural systems of injustice. We're witnessing blatant strategies to undergird evil public policies that will take decades to undo. And yet the present crisis also highlights courageous women, Black women and other women of color who, along with our allies, have to deal with unfathomable grief. And yet they're being transformed into public advocacy as change agents. The strength of multicultural women from all walks of life must be utilized to become civic leaders and community organizers for such a time as this. And so as I read and heard it said recently that this nation, world, and we are witnessing a Kairos moment of changing times that call us to move from silent docility to collective action. The outcome is unknown, but this is when we step out on faith. And women have typically been the ones to raise voices to confront injustice and challenge the status quo. And so we must support our young people on the front lines of the justice struggle. And I believe that women's studies of religion and like programs around the country must help to cultivate female scholars and leaders. Now is the time to strategically become co-conspirators for justice. We must fight, we must write, we must advocate, we must join the front lines for our future generations. However, this requires multi-ethnic and multiracial grappling with racialized privileges of whiteness and with religious complicity in exclusionary practices. So why, you ask, the Change Agent book is timely and meaningful? Writing this book has been a long journey and not without a great deal of emotion. As some of the organizational theory took root in parts of my doctorate of ministry research, but I was compelled by my community organizing training to deepen my examination of public witness as embodied theological praxis during the Oakland marches against the police-involved murder of unarmed Oscar Grant in 2009. Trayvon Martin's assassination in 2012, and the eruption of visceral anger in the 2014 aftermath of Michael Brown's horrific murder unmasked the oppressive conditions that Ferguson represented, but also unmasked the conditions all around our country. And these were defining moments when I sought to investigate why comparatively few faith leaders were present as strategic advocates. I channeled my anger to delve deeper, to investigate, and to encourage increased collaboration. So first, why Black Lives Matter Times in the title? As much as the civil rights era made strides for Black people, the tensions of disparity in subsequent decades signal that racial dissonance did not end, but strategies fueling a deeper undercurrent of public political rhetoric continued in cyclical crescendos. In other words, political correctness drove the injustice underground to some extent. It became more pernicious. It became more sophisticated in the ways that it hid itself in public policy changes. And so I approached the era that I call Black Lives Matter Times, marking it from the Nixon administration to the present dynamics. Black Lives Matter Times, I'm saying, is an era that serves as a backdrop for identifying key issues for theoethical deliberation. Several movements are included in this long view of the era. And yet I see the Black Lives Matter protests, 2014 to present, as the powder keg resulting from decades of intentional targeting and stripping of rights that we hoped to gain during the civil rights era. Comparison of the eras in chapter 3 isn't intended to offer exhaustive historical detail because I'm not a historian, but to urge change agent leaders to keep an extended view of these linked events in our Black Lives Matter times or era. Do we in classes and in collegial faith forums, do we discuss how planned government chaos eroded public policies? How increasing structural enforcement of systemic discrimination and the rise of evangelicalism is connected to supremacy resurgence? Do we talk about the confluence of increased privatization and capitalistic autonomy that in turn decrease government oversight of social assistance that was expected as a civic duty? And do we realize that we are witnessing a systematic turning of a blind eye to other societal factors that precipitate social crisis? Do we share this with our faith members? Do our children know? That's what led me to write this book. And why does it matter? I was struck by the silence of religious institutions and denominational leaders, whether conservative or traditional, as well as non-Black interreligious communities. And yes, let me be clear, there were prophetic leaders in 2014, like Reverend Tracy Blackman and others, who captured national attention, not because they craved the spotlight, but because their faith conviction for justice moved them in public solidarity to be present amid the intergenerational outrage in their communities. The rising disharmony, the strident disregard for equitable justice, the onslaught of blatant racialized attacks were all factors that moved me to link the urgent crisis in our cities with the increased urgency for churches and interreligious collaboration to mobilize with our communities in roles of public witness as agents for change. The questions along the theological and racial spectrum of vocational colleagues, not just in the academy, and among friends, often had similar themes. What can we do? How can we prepare ourselves, let alone a congregation? Where can we make a difference? And even, why should I? So the book opens with a question: where's the church? Notable as an expressed sentiment by community activist leaders who critique what they view as the hypocrisy of religio-politics prevalent in the public landscape, which gives rise to another question. Is the church's message justice for all or just us? I'll say that again. Is the church's message justice for all or just us? Allow me to read from the intro on page 2 and 43. I've synthesized it together. I define public witness as a faith-informed commitment to take action in solidarity with the marginalized and to help mobilize change. Our theology informs how we might engage in transformative roles and formulate correctives to systematic issues of injustice. Thus, public witness is a primary discipleship role for a change agent church. A key strategy for public witness lies in an insistent hope and committed preparation with reflection and assessment. By engaging with justice activists and interreligious and multi-ethnic partners, public action for solidarity can align or leverage resources and the formation of inclusive collectives. In short, we've got to outnumber the evil that thinks it's winning in our country and in our world. And that's the purpose of the book in a nutshell. I hope the book stirs discourse on ways that theological and ethical dilemmas intersect when interfaith leaders are confronted by disparities in justice values and ethical actions, which raises the urgency to reflect on what could and should be our communal actions, whether or not the gospel is our primary guide. Furthermore, how do we confront what I discuss in the book as doctrinal or ideological stances to remain silent and reticent to engage in public justice issues that some leaders view as too political or too confrontational? And so that leads me to who is the book for? I would say the book is a multi-layered resource for multi-leader audiences. And it can be read in interdisciplinary academic courses to critically analyze how religious and ideological distinctions impact our view of justice. As well, the book is for community and pastoral leaders and justice activists to utilize the concepts and the tools for frank discussion, action strategies in their diverse contexts. I hope that Christian pastors, theologians gather with interfaith colleagues. We can't afford to be siloed by what we think are theological differences because we have too many ethical shared concerns that impact those that we love and work with in our community. So open discourse in congregational groups and public groups is crucial, since conscientization is a learning strategy that I discussed to raise awareness of the issues in order to increase participation in public justice witness. I must write from my Christian context, but I invite community partners who have public justice aims that span across interreligious traditions to take the constructive principles that I offer and contextualize them within Jewish, Hindu, Muslim, and indigenous traditions to inform our shared ethical visions for collaboration. I contend that prophetic public witness is not optional. We have a moral imperative as people of faith to follow a transcendent mandate for justice. However, leaders in community and academy cannot ethically demand public reforms of structural injustices while ignoring the hypocrisy of unjust practices that still exist in our own organizational systems and structures, that still exist in our churches, that exist in our academy, that exist in some of our community justice organizations. In other words, we can't scream for justice in the public square and ignore how sexism, misogyny, homophobia, race, and other isms are used internally to alienate and exclude rather than include people as one family of God. And so the term change agent generically connotes Christian, interfaith, or secular context of any racial, ethnic, or communal affiliation. When I use change agent, I'm using that rather than to delineate by church, mosque, temple, or non-religious affiliated activist communities. Again, the rationale and the tools are offered to encourage a collective groundswell of increased collaboration that is so urgently needed. What do we need to bring about change, social reform activism, and life-changing justice? I think addressing injustice in Black Lives Matter times is not solely a Black church problem. And here I want to share this excerpt as a crucial caveat from the introduction. Although the book is situated in our present climate of volatile disunity, the onus of responsibility to engage the issues is not directed solely to Black church leaders and congregants. Non-Black leaders need to acknowledge an equal, if not greater, share of responsibility to challenge the marginalization found in religious and secular practice, and to uphold a justice ethos for humane and compassionate interactions of relational care. I engage with theorists who argue that cultural constructions of racialized privilege benefit people who are born into a socially prescribed norm of whiteness. Therefore, non-Black leaders who ascribe to possess justice consciousness are best positioned to raise the issues of injustice with peers, for whom privilege exclusivity in systems and structures are taken for granted. And so if time permits, let me run through the chapters quickly as an overview. The book has 3 parts. Part 1 offers societal perspectives. Part 2, theoethical perspectives. And part 3 engages contextual perspectives. And a reader can start at any one of those parts depending on where they want to place their emphasis. In chapter 1, under societal perspectives, it's entitled Black Lives Matter Times, Why the Church as Change Agent. This chapter situates and describes the societal dynamics in this era of Black Lives Matter times. And I focus on what is a change agent church and describe adaptive change theory pertinent to preparing ourselves for public witness and justice mobilization. So readers can delve into internal and external factors impacting change agent leadership roles, discuss conceptual justice strategies for crucial roles in public witness. For example, the negative connotation of disruption is deconstructed to propose an ethos of disruptive justice. Protest as disruption is immediate and necessary, but it is short-term. Disruptive justice, on the other hand, seeks sustainable actions that must lead to long-term change. Also discuss reparations. I discuss it as an ethos of distributive justice, and an ethos of public restorative justice is described as a long-term communal circle with accountability. And the late Dale Andrews was at the forefront of articulating Black theology of praxis to raise awareness in our justice roles and responsibilities, how we as scholars can also be present in the collaborative uplift of our communities. And so Black practical theology has moved beyond liturgy to the sphere of public theology, also described by Black philosophical ethicist Victor Anderson as lived theology. So chapter 1 examines those ways to navigate our landscape and provides some concepts as background. Chapter 2 is entitled Toxic Silence, Rogue Practices, Double Standards, and Lemming Behavior. And from the news and anonymous stories of colleagues, I investigate rogue practices on our streets and in our churches, the internal biases of double standards in gendered leadership that adversely excludes capable leaders on the basis of race, gender, and sexuality, as well as the toxic dangers of lemming behavior, with the examples in our public witness right now, fueled by Make America Great Again, MAGA ideology. And we're witnessing unquestioning lemming attitudes with blind refusal to reason. So how do we negotiate? By reasoning to the heart, when the soul has been co-opted by racialized fear of losing supremacist benefits. This thing called religiopolitics has co-opted our theopraxis, and justice-conscious faith leaders still can't afford to be silent. We must understand the intersections of inclusivity, and we must still, with compassion, challenge those preconceived notions of privilege. And so chapter 3, I'll hurry on, is entitled, Can Dry Bones Live? Societal Challenges to Solidarity and Survival. And I touch on a little bit some antecedent history to look at the evolved religious roles and justice roles during the Reconstruction period, segregationist period, and the integrationist periods. And I raised some roles. This is probably the chapter where I focus the most on the Black church, because the Black church had to be the prophetic center at one time. And I raised the Black church to discuss the urgency for the Black church to not only return to public witness roles and to be our moral compass of justice, but also to urge other non-Black churches that you're not off the hook. You have to join in as well, because part of the issues historically has been because of the discrimination and the racism. And so I also look at secularization and disengagement when we talk about the nuns and the millennial dynamics of sort of seeding from the church. I look at the parallels and distinctions of what I call schisms that warrant our attention. And when millennial activist Tef Poe said, "This ain't your mama's civil rights era," they were right. We urgently need to appreciate the intergenerational worldviews to center crucial roles of millennial leaders and future generations of justice activists. And so chapter 4 begins section 2, the theoethical perspectives. And chapter 4 is entitled Weary Hope, Restorative Ethics in the Praxis of Social Reform Activism. And I consider this my pivotal chapter because it frames the constructs of social reform activism with a womanist communitarian rationale and lens to contrast against the individualistic libertarian views of just mine, get yours.
Mm-hmm.
This framework of social reform activism that I developed is a praxis model, and it's comprised of ethical components with affirming values and action steps that we don't have time to go into in detail. But I want to raise a point about one of the outcomes, long-term outcomes of this social reform activism framework is to establish a public restorative justice ethos. And I want to distinguish public restorative justice because part of restorative justice is this notion of reconciliation. And I'm not talking about reconciliation as mere forgiveness of the perpetrators, but I'm talking about reconciliation as steps of accountable reform that we must oversee and make sure gets instituted. And so we have some, as we urge readers to share these concepts, we have some that are going to wrestle. Why or how are some churches linking discipleship with active praxis to challenge oppression outside of our sanctuaries, while others hold to an insular focus on inward spirituality centered on sectarian eschatological beliefs? Now that's a long term. In other words, they lean in on piety. Why piety over prophetic praxis? They're not incompatible. And we need our piety to reflect on how we should be out there being prophets. And so chapter 5, God sees, engaging a womanist theoethic hermeneutic, is really me incorporating and dialoguing with varied voices of womanist biblical scholars and ethicists who enrich the discourse on New Testament and Old Testament scriptural messaging to help readers reflect on our theological and ethical understanding of embodied justice in our praxis. In your context, what does your sacred text say to you? Not what somebody told you it said, but what gleams and jumps out at you as justice messaging. In part 3, chapter 6, shifts from the theory and the reflection to being titled Doing the Work, Adaptive Methods for Contextual Praxis. And this is the toolkits methods chapter. I sought to develop a toolkit of methods to guide adaptive change processes from my years of leadership development and organizational work in private business and public nonprofit sectors. But theopraxis is a concept that involves linking your personal faith to reflective discourse in order to apply it to our ministry context. The steps are not prescriptive, one size fits all, but can be tailored by interreligious and activist groups to facilitate action strategies. And finally, chapter 7, On the Road to Oz, Urgency for Prophetic Social Change. That chapter is a summation of the views that I express on my own, views that I glean from lots of research on what's ahead as we see societal shifts with new urgency for public square activism. I outline areas and emphasize that public issues would get worse before they got better. And sadly, on that point, I think I was correct. I didn't ever anticipate COVID-19 crisis, but I sense that the levels of supremacist desperation to retain places of privilege and the co-optation of religio-politics would increase and will increase as we experience this era of Black Lives Matter times. So get ready, take your vitamins, be informed, have your artisanal of arguments and questions, because we can't win by fighting people who are so closed-minded. We win by helping them to self-reflect on who their actions help and who their actions harm. So I'm going to stop there because I think the other part of my thoughts will be captured as we talk about on being change agents.
Well, let's give a hand. You're right. There is just so much. I'm so glad this is being recorded, for one thing, because there is so very much in your words and in your book for us really to grapple with and drink from. As in our various contexts, we seek to enable the church to be change agent church, including that enormous task of dismantling the pernicious presence and power of white supremacy, and including building, as you call for, an ethos of public restorative justice in the midst of an incredibly privatized culture, privatized in part by the reigning form of capitalist economy that is now dictating the shape of culture as and just about every dimension of life. So it's really hard to think about which questions to narrow in on for you, but let me go back to your chapter, especially that's drawing upon womanist theoethics, and you're bringing up your insistence on building public policies and cultural support for an ethos of public restorative justice. And I think that's just so important because the white church so easily slips away from that into notions of reconciliation that have to do with somehow coming back to a, as they say, like kumbaya, sort of we're all together without really doing the reparations work that is necessary. So let me just note or call you to comment in light of your book on the powerful movement to defund the police and to build alternatives to policing, and you bringing your womanist theoethical perspective and toolkit to everything. Can you give us some insight into what a womanist theoethical perspective, how that illumines the call, the fervent call to defunding police and building alternatives to the policing of society? Could we start there?
Sure. Now, as a practical theologian, I'm bringing theoethical and theopraxis lenses to the landscape, and so I was most informed. I will say my primary ethicist in the writing of the book that I use is Reverend Dr. Emily Towns, to engage her theoethical constructions of cultural evil in her 2006 book, Cultural Production of Evil. And Towns, for me, analyzed, the analytical perspectives were relevant to ground not only my proposal of social reform activism, but to be more aware how these, what she calls the fantastic hegemonic imagination, is so deeply interwoven into our culture that we have to be careful about the sound bites and the double entendres of the messaging. And I used her intentionally, rather than centering on historically male Eurocentric framings that are inadequate to analyze the disparate realities that we're living in. And so this bandwagon to disband and get rid of the police. My hermeneutic of suspicion certainly says that we need deep police reforms, and we need to replace the rogue cops and make sure that we have leadership in the head so that everything's not run by these police unions. When we see police walking off the job saying they'd rather not be a policeman anymore, if you're going to vilify us or call us thugs, we have to know how to deconstruct that and turn it around. But that's what you've been calling us all over the country for years and years and years. And so the fragility of not liking when the tables are turned is something we need to be aware of. Also, we need to be aware of is this bandwagon of just dismantling all police and banning all police means that if, and there is an element of anarchists that go around to peaceful marches and vandalize and break windows and do everything so that the peaceful marchers and Black Lives Matter activists can be blamed. So if we dismantle or ban everything, what keeps that element from going around and wreaking civic havoc, and then blaming us for not wanting police anymore? See, the element that didn't want police are the ones that's causing the trouble, and we end up with an even more oppressive system coming back in force. I think that what we need to do is take advantage of what our federal government has done by decentralizing and moving a lot of our rights to the states so that every state can do its thing, often unjustly. But we have to start at grassroots levels of our communities and talk to our police, talk to our civic leaders about our expectations and the accountability measures that are needed so that we can work together as community policing with accountability to each other. I can't say, Cynthia, that across the country, we don't need policing. In fact, we need ethical police to hold some of these racists accountable who go around thinking they can be vigilantes and shooting or killing or spitting on people for walking through their neighborhood when it also is our neighborhood. So the dismantling mantra, I haven't quite bought into yet, but I think that one of the advantages of the decentralization is that every community has an opportunity to start at the grassroots level, to form collaboratives, to get to know those in power positions and help them to know that they are there because of us. We're beyond respectability politics of just sitting back, and I'm not demeaning holding a candle or doing a prayer meeting, but we've got to get in front of those folks with an already prepared strategy that we have collaboratively devised, and then hold them accountable. And so each city, each community can bring about a different kind of police enforcement if we are able to do it. Now that means that the civic leaders, the police chiefs, and the police unions also have to be willing to do this. They're still in denial, even though the FBI had reported it long ago. They're in denial that a lot of supremacists and other extremists have been hired as part of our police force. And so the instantaneous use of violence to the point of death might be more that person's psyche that person's conditioning, that person's hatred, than the entire police department. I hope I answered.
Thank you. Oh, I'm so interested in that you root some of what you're saying also in the intersection between your work and that of Dr. Emily Towns, who also has been very influential in my work, and her use of the cultural production of evil. And I think about the just the insidious presence of assumptions of white supremacy undergirding white assumptions about police, and the importance of seeing, just becoming clear about assumptions that kind of rage quietly in the consciousness of being enculturated by white supremacy, and the importance of, well, let me ask you one other thing. And partly in your bringing up of Dr. Emily Towns, who does such a beautiful job of linking economic violence and racial violence and gender-based violence. And I wonder, you have spoken regarding the intersections of the COVID crisis and racism in this country. Can you speak also to how you might see patriarchy, sexism, and gender at play in that intersection, and then what you see as the role of the church in that, and the kind of trifold intersection of race and class and gender, as it's playing out now in relationship to Black Lives Matter?
Sure, I'll do my best. I'm reminded not only by Dr. Towns's work, how much imagery is enfolded into our cultural psyche that we might not even know about. So therefore, young people and some people might be saying, why in the world is General Mills or whoever the manufacturers, why are they responding to Black Lives Matter by wanting to change the Aunt Jemima box or Uncle Ben's rice? You know, and you have to be in the Black community perhaps to understand the derogative images that those products conveyed all along, and now the rush to change them. There are so many images like that that are integrated into our communities. When a public service commercial comes on about helping those in need, or, you know, often what flashes on the screen is a Black person's face, as though we instantly are the ones that are using the system and have needs, when actually there's data to show that more non-Blacks are on welfare or have needs for those services. The point is that I think I also have gotten from philosopher Martha Nussbaum, who's done work in developing countries and done work with women, even in their circumstance where perhaps that culture considered women subordinate second-class citizens per se, women still are realizing their power as nurturers of family, as links to community. And so I think that women can also use their voices. I'm reminded of these mothers who have channeled their loss of sons and daughters into some very powerful public work. And I think that we need to think about ways that we can do that as well, and encourage, be the voices of conscience. If a slew of us went to some of these public meetings along with our activist sistren and brethren to say, I am a mother. I have children impacted by these concerns. I have concern when all of us are told that our health depends on our wearing a mask, but I can't send my son to Safeway because the guard instantly thinks he's coming to burglarize the store and makes him remove his mask or denies him access. They need to hear that we're sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I think that again, the power has come from, in any movement, the power has come from the grassroots and it has come from the young people. But keep in mind that our sons and daughters and grandchildren, this wacko world is all they know. They grew up in this madness. And so it is natural for them to react with visceral anger as the response, because we were busy teaching them that you are somebody and you have dreams, but nothing in our society, very little in our society, has confirmed that for them. So they get angry. Mothers, women, sisters, aunties, nanas can get out there and help. Church leaders can get out there and help, not to tell them what to do, but to help them find ways to channel that anger so that when they go forward, they can speak what justifiably is on their heart and minds, rather than just spewing a bunch of cuss words or vandalizing something. I think that the anger is shared across ethnic lines. I see my son's friends, whether Asian, Latino, Hispanic, white, whatever their ethnicity, if their heart understands justice and being intersectionally disenfranchised in any way, even for their sexuality, they are there in support of an issue that shares an ethical call to challenge the injustice. And so I think that we have more power at the grassroots than we realize. And that if the groundswell begins in every neighborhood and every city, and if we have the moral voices along with the brilliant strategists of activists like Second Acts and Sherry Murphy, we can make a real difference. And I hope that in this time that we don't just sit back and rely on November 1st voting, because we have people in power who have already said they're not going to get out. And I have not tried to make my book a political book because I want it to go on beyond this era. But I'm just saying, if we let this kind of ideology persist and foment, we're in for tougher times, folks. I can't hear you. You're muted. Yes. The mic seemed to have gone in and out a little bit. So keep doing a check. Let me say another thing about COVID-19. And this is for women, sisters, and our brothers to be mindful of. When we first were made aware, reluctantly, of the COVID-19 pandemic, and there is a powerful interactive data tool that is going around on social media that shows the small number of cases in January and February and how it exponentially moved up, so that COVID-19 moved up among the world diseases to the very top and almost off the charts. In that kind of crisis, where we reside in a country where the leaders have decided that since COVID-19 doesn't seem to be inordinately impacting them, meaning the elitist class that have access to constant testing and private doctors, and because the COVID-19 crisis seems to inordinately affect poor people, Native American reservations, Black people with preconditions, Latino people who because of the whole immigrant injustice, which is a whole nother conversation, are afraid to go to the hospitals. Once they discovered who COVID-19 was impacting, well, then there's no need for any more testing, and there's no need for pouring this money into kits. They want to stop protecting doctors and hospitals. And so it's no wonder that people of color, Blacks and other peoples of color, who get already inordinately turned away from healthcare, given an aspirin and go home and see what happens, and they die. We are suspect of what this COVID-19 now opened everything up. Let's support our businesses, go back to the restaurants, go back to the beach, go back to the hair salons. We are suspect because, again, my womanist hermeneutic of suspicion, I see it as a way to further thin our numbers. And so raising awareness within our faith communities that might not have had these kinds of experiences, raising awareness that these experiences really do exist, helps to conscientize them, to understand, not to be ashamed. I'm not having anyone be ashamed of their whiteness or their Blackness. But if I know a brother or sister is being discriminated against systemically by the same system that I expect to protect me, then there is something with our faith consciousness that ought to make you want to question that and to be a difference.
You're here. So, Dr. Myles Tribble, I am realizing that it's almost 5 o'clock.
Yes.
And I want to give you a minute just to segue into looking at women's studies in religion and the program for which you are chair. And can you just give us some insight into the role that you see this program playing at this particular juncture in history and this intersection of economic and racial violence?
Okay, so as a part of my accolades and shout out to women's studies of religion, let me give a shout out to my beloved sister and biblical scholar, Mitzi Smith, and brilliant scholar, biblical scholar, activist, Aubrey Hendricks, because I've learned so much from both of their scholarship and books to really look critically at the gospel. And so for those of us in the theological academy, Aubrey, for example, authored The Politics of Jesus. For those of us in the academy, we need to not be afraid to raise the question, what type of gospel am I modeling? Am I modeling the gospel where what I call a hallmarkicized version of the meek and suffering lamb of Jesus to theologize docility? Or do we model a gospel that's prophetically grounded on proclaiming a radically transformative message to speak truth to power for divine justice, even if it means that we become an enemy of the state? I translate this to our role in our work in women's studies of religion, that we on the steering committee have a responsibility to encourage our students, female students, and like-minded male students, because we've had some male students go through the certificated program. We have to encourage them to have the courage to find their voice, to reflect on, am I wanting to research and write on something because somebody told me to do it? Or am I wanting to raise this as a prickly topic that maybe, you know, my faculty won't like. So Women's Studies of Religion, help me find an advisor who would support me in this. I think that we have an opportunity to be one of the cutting edge places in our institution, the Graduate Theological Union. And I do want to give a shout out. I don't think he's on, and it's not for that purpose, but I appreciate our interim president and Dean Uriah Kim for the support that he has given us to use our voices, to raise our voices, to call out injustice. And some of our panels, and I'm sure some to come, as well as our writings, aren't always docile. I know I don't know quite how to be. And so I appreciate being at a place where we can have discussions, where we can raise questions, and even where we can agree not to agree. But we still have this diversity, we invite this diversity of thought at the GTU that I love. And I hope that Women's Studies of Religion will be at the cutting edge to encourage students who are considering the GTU. We're another step of why we can say you ought to come. Because if you are a scholar, whether non-binary or not, if you are a scholar that wants to pursue gender justice, female justice, intersectionality, all of these issues, indigenous religions from an African, Caribbean, or Latino roots, this is a place where I at least have not seen yet that someone has said you can't do it. In fact, those who used to say you can't do it, thank goodness they've moved on or retired. But we have a responsibility. And I think that we can help the GTU with recruiting, if they let us. And we can also, we're there through the students' whole time at the GTU to be a place of support, and through our seminars and through our sponsored events and through our webinars with our hosting, Reverend Dr. Eminent Scholar, Reverend Dr. Renita Weems to come. And there's more that we can host, both a feminist and womanist. I think that we do our community a great service, and that is our calling.
Well, I want to thank you for the brilliance and the courage that went into the writing of this book, and the brilliance and the courage that you are showing in using this book in the world and bringing it into the world.
Thank you.
I also
tell my friends that I know I'm going to get in trouble with this book, but bring it.
Well, you've got some sisters here who've got your back. But I also want to thank you just for the kind of vision that you have for women's studies in religion at the GTU. It's a terrific and powerful vision. It bears also taking just a moment to thank Sheryl Johnson, who has been serving and done an incredible job as coordinator of women's studies in religion. And also for this session, to thank also Elizabeth Pena of the Center for Art and Religion at the GTU, who, as much as anyone, enabled this hour to take place. So let's give both Sheryl and Elizabeth also a hand of thanks. With that, if I could pass this back to Sheryl Johnson, who will, I believe, close us out and send us on our way to make a difference as change agent in this world at this time. Sheryl.
Yes, and thank you so much. And the one person we haven't thanked yet is our moderator, Cynthia Moe-Lobeda. So I'd encourage us to pull our hands out one more time. And thank you also for your leadership. And to all of our steering committee members who are present here today. Our steering committee is also always looking for new members. So that's another possibility if this has excited you to get more involved. So thank you all so much for showing up. I think we all have a book that we need to be keeping an eye out for very, very soon. I think it should be available. So I really encourage you to read it, and thank one more time our wonderful chair and speaker today, Dr. Valerie Miles-Tribble.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming today. And I'm sorry we didn't get to your questions, but let's continue the conversation in a future forum.
Amen. Amen. Thank you. Thank you.